It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. Now we continue our WNYC Centennial Series, 100 Years of 100 Things. It's thing number 14, 100 years of memorable speech clips from Democratic conventions. We did the same thing with Republican convention speeches, you may remember, during their week last month. And if you were listening yesterday, you heard a sample from one of those most memorable speeches, the one at the 1948 Democratic Convention by the mayor of Minneapolis at the time, Hubert Humphrey. To make a segue into today's 100 Things episode, let's hear one more clip from that time that Humphrey tried to wake his party up about civil rights. The old audio on this is very scratchy, but worth putting up with it. It runs 30 seconds.
My good friends, I asked my party, I asked the Democratic Party to march down the high road of progressive democracy. I asked this convention to say in unmistakable terms that we proudly hail and we courageously support our president and leader, Harry Truman, in his great fight for civil rights in America.
Hubert Humphrey in 1948, 20 years before he was the nominee for president. And that'll be one of our themes of this 100-year segments today, memorable convention speeches by people other than the nominee. With us as our guide through history for this is David Greenberg, journalism, media studies, and history professor at Rutgers, and author of the book Republic of Spin, An Inside History of the American Presidency, published in 2016, which traces 100 years of presidents trying to spin the press. Did you know the first presidential press conference wasn't until Woodrow Wilson in 1913? I learned that from David Greenberg's book. He also has a forthcoming one that's a biography of the congressman and civil rights leader John Lewis. David, thanks for lending your 100 years of history chops to this. Welcome back to WNYC.
Sure, great to be with you, Brian.
So take us back a little more than 100 years to start, 111 years to be exact, to that first Woodrow Wilson press conference. It's not about a convention, but I think our listeners will be interested. Why him? Why then? And why hadn't there been a press conference before? There certainly were newspapers covering all the presidents.
Sure. Well, this was a time at which the presidency was growing in power and stature and influence. If you look at 19th century presidents, they weren't out there before the public constantly the way presidents are today. And it was really Congress that was the center of the action. So if you were a Washington reporter, you were going to the galleries in the Senate to cover how politics was being made. And the presidency was a, relatively speaking, less powerful office. It's really in the progressive era, first Teddy Roosevelt and then Woodrow Wilson, that the power of the presidency expands dramatically. And that power is rooted in communicating with the public and purporting to represent the public in a way that, presidents, of course, always had in a certain sense, but not in sort of the direct, constantly engaged sense. And that includes engaging with the press. So TR had done sort of these informal press conferences. He'd be getting his afternoon shave, and he'd have a handful of reporters kind of gathered around him as he sort of held forth. But it was Wilson who sort of rationalized the process. He was a big believer in efficiency and systematization. And so this was a chance for all the reporters from Washington to kind of gather on a regular basis and put questions to the president.
Can you imagine Biden or Trump or Obama or any of them having reporters sit around while they're getting a shave? Just briefly, to satisfy curiosity, what did they ask about in 2013? And what was the state of the presidential spin game at that first presidential official news conference?
Well, Wilson, despite his good intentions and sort of wanting to open up the presidency, he talked a lot about publicity, which, was starting to mean what we take it to mean today, kind of spin or putting forth your take on things, but also just meant making things public and kind of opening up those back rooms where deliberations were made for the press and by extension the public to see. So people asked about, all kinds of different policy initiatives and the direction that his new presidency intended to go. They were also, as reporters can be, a bit tough. And Wilson, who was not sort of the warmest, most cuddly of men, had a bit of a stiff reaction. So he never quite developed the warm rapport that Teddy Roosevelt had, or that we associate with successors like Franklin Roosevelt or JFK, who history remembers as being so effective in charming the press, in dodging questions effectively when they need to, humoring the press, becoming friends with many reporters. Wilson had a much kind of cooler and more standoffish personality, and he eventually sort of abandoned these press conferences once World War I got underway.
So now to our main act for this segment, speeches at Democratic conventions by people other than the nominee. Since we did a whole segment on the 1948 Hubert Humphrey speech yesterday, I want to go right on to another Democratic convention speech by someone who wasn't the candidate. The year is 1964. The theme again is civil rights, and this is Fannie Lou Hamer trying to get delegate credentials for an alternative group from her state of Mississippi called the Mississippi Freedom Delegation. For people who don't know this history, they contended that the official delegation from the state, all white, was selected in an illegal, segregated process in Mississippi in 1964. And Fannie Lou Hamer made the case in part by telling the harrowing story of her own experience in Mississippi just trying to register to vote. We'll pick it up when the owner of the cotton plantation she's working on as a sharecropper learns that she did that.
Plantation owner came and said, "Fannie Lou, do you know, did Pap tell you what I said?" And I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Well, I mean that if you don't go down and withdraw your registration, you will have to leave. That then if you go down and withdraw, that you still might have to go because we are not ready for that in Mississippi." And I addressed him and told him that I didn't try to register for you. I tried to register for myself. I had to leave that same night.
So apparently she got fired from her job for daring to register to vote. We'll skip way ahead in the speech, but the infuriating story that she tells winds up with Fannie Lou Hamer in jail, and she says this.
I began to scream, and one white man got up and began to beat me in my head and tell me to hush. One white man, my dress had worked up high. He walked over and pulled my dress. I pulled my dress down, and he pulled my dress back up. I was in jail when Medgar Evers was murdered. All of this is on account of we want to register to become first-class citizens. And if the Freedom Democratic Party is not seated now, I question America. Is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off of the hook because our lives be threatened daily, because we want to live as decent human beings in America? Thank you.
Is this America? Fannie Lou Hamer at the 1964 Democratic Convention. Historian David Greenberg is our guest. David, if conventions today are basically four-night television commercials, there was a case 60 years ago when a convention scene was so raw and genuine and highly conflicted, even when the nominee, Lyndon Johnson, had already been selected. That was a truly important, memorable convention speech, right?
Yes, and it was so dramatic and compelling that Lyndon Johnson, who was not yet in Atlantic City for the convention, suddenly announced a press conference or press availability and got all the networks to switch away because he made them think he was going to announce his vice presidential choice. And it turned out he had nothing to say. He just wanted to get the cameras off Mrs. Hamer. it backfired because then that night, all the networks showed the speech anyway on the nightly news, and more people ended up seeing it. But look, the story of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, we could spend the whole hour on. This was really at the fulcrum, the core moment of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And despite the Civil Rights Act having been passed earlier that summer, there was still no Voting Rights Act. And this was a bid for the Black people of Mississippi to say, we demand representation as the Constitution guarantees us. Her testimony, which was not in prime time before the convention itself, it was before the Credentials Committee. So it was a fight to see whether the segregated official Mississippi delegation or this alternative integrated delegation would be seated. That's what people were watching kind of with rapt attention. And, this woman, sharecropper, unknown to most Americans, with her incredibly powerful testimony, just, blew people away.
I see there's Fannie Lou Hamer 1964 convention speech. Breaking news this morning, believe it or not. That convention, as you noted, was in Atlantic City. And just yesterday, the state of New Jersey installed a commemorative plaque on the boardwalk there in honor of the speech and its 60th anniversary. Did you know that?
I didn't know that, but, deservedly so. I mean, it's a true historic moment. And as I say, sort of one that just galvanized the nation, drew attention to the lack of representation in the Deep South, particularly states like Mississippi and Alabama, where, despite ostensible constitutional protections, Blacks basically were deprived of the vote.
And I gather, before we move on to other speeches from other conventions, that there's kind of a sad, imperfect addendum to the Hubert Humphrey story in this respect. He was about to be announced as Lyndon Johnson's running mate at that 64 convention, but I've read that he brokered a proposed deal under which the all-white segregated official Mississippi delegation would keep their seats, but 2 additional ones would be added for the Mississippi Freedom members. But the Mississippi Freedom Group rejected it as too small a gesture. So Humphrey had gone from leading-edge civil rights champion at the 48 convention to, I guess, small steps compromising insider by 68.
By 64, yeah. That's
64, right.
Right. And, to be fair to Hubert, I think of it as kind of a tragic story. He was just caught in an impossible position. Lyndon Johnson was terribly afraid that seating the MFDP, as it was called, would cost him the election, which, he wins in a landslide. In retrospect, that seems sort of absurd, but George Wallace had done well in the Democratic primaries. There were the Harlem riots. There was a sense that a kind of backlash was brewing against civil rights, and Johnson was afraid of going too far. So he basically forced both Hubert Humphrey and Walter Reuter, who was a labor leader, to kind of do his bidding and try to force this compromise onto the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. As you say, they rejected it. Ed Henry, one of their members, compared taking the 2 seats to, Blacks having 2 seats in the balconies, having to sit in the balconies in segregated theaters. I'm sorry, I said Ed Henry, I meant Aaron Henry. So, there was a real sense we didn't come all this way, as Mrs. Hamer said, for just 2 seats. In retrospect, the compromise did have one very important component, which is it said, in the future, you could not have a segregated delegation. So by 1968, all Democratic delegations from every state, even Mississippi, have to be integrated. So there was a victory in there that wasn't fully appreciated at the time. But of course, if you're there to be seated in 64, you don't really want to be told you have to wait till 1968.
Right. Listeners, if you're just joining us, it's 100 years of 100 things. Thing number 14, 100 years of memorable moments from Democratic convention speeches, mostly by speakers other than the nominee. with David Greenberg from Rutgers and author of the book Republic of Spin, An Inside History of the American Presidency. And moving on in history, I know that one non-nominee speech you wanted to highlight was Ted Kennedy's at the 1980 convention after he failed in his bid to unseat President Jimmy Carter by primarying Carter around the country that year. Here's a minute and a half of Ted Kennedy in defeat at the convention in 1980.
Well, things worked out a little different from the way I thought, but let me tell you, I still love New York. My fellow Democrats and my fellow Americans, I have come here tonight not to argue as a candidate, but to affirm a cause. I am asking you to renew the commitment of the Democratic Party to economic justice. I am asking you to renew our commitment to a fair and lasting prosperity that can put America back to work. This is the cause that brought me into the campaign and that sustained me for 9 months across 100,000 miles in 40 different states. We had our losses, but the pain of our defeats is far, far less than the pain of the people that I have met.
Ted Kennedy, 1980. David, again, not the most unified, everyone is on message article of spin we might expect today. What do you think about the context of that speech?
Well, people have to remember that Jimmy Carter, as fondly as we remember him today, really disappointed a great number of Democrats, both liberals, but also moderates. I mean, he kind of, had enough troubles and failures as president that he kind of lost his base. He ended up rallying in the primaries to get the delegates he needed. But the Ted Kennedy candidacy was, it was also sort of, the last of the Kennedys, here after JFK and RFK had been murdered. He carried the hopes sort of a whole generation. And it was this sort of beautiful, eloquent speech. He ends it with this phrase, "The dream shall never die," that is basically saying, we've lost this race, but the ideals of liberalism, the ideals that the Democratic Party has held to over the last, 50 or some years are not going away. And he's going to continue to be the standard bearer for that in the United States Senate, which, of course, he went on to do and arguably, became one of our greatest senators. And perhaps it was a better role for him. We can't say really, but then the presidency might have been.
So that was 1980. Just 4 years later, 1984, very different context, as Walter Mondale is the Democratic nominee, Carter's former vice president and former senator from Minnesota. He would get blown out by Ronald Reagan in November. But making a national name for himself at that convention was the governor of New York, Mario Cuomo. Here's 2 minutes of his moral cry on behalf of his party in 1984.
The middle class, those people who work for a living because they have to, not because some psychiatrist told them it was a convenient way to fill the interval between birth and eternity. White collar and blue collar, young professionals, men and women in small business, desperate for the capital and contracts that they need to prove their worth. We speak for the minorities who have not yet entered the mainstream. We speak for ethnics who want to add their culture to the magnificent mosaic that is America. We speak We speak for women who are indignant that this nation refuses to etch into its governmental commandments the simple rule, thou shalt not sin against equality. A rule so simple. I was going to say, and I perhaps dare not, but I will. It's a commandment so simple it can be spelled in 3 letters. E-R-A.
Governor Mario Cuomo at the 1984 Democratic Convention. Julian Hastings is calling in about that speech. Julie, I think you didn't know we were going to play that clip. Hi, you're on the air.
Oh, hi. Thanks, Brian. Mario Cuomo, eloquent and substantive, so much so that his keynote in 84 instantly made him a front runner for 88. The peak of Reagan's popularity, when Reagan's talking about the city, President Reagan's talking about the city on a hill, that patriotism and freedom being small government, and Governor Cuomo talking about 2 cities, that he's arguing that the Reagan administration and Republicans are policies, their trickle-down economics is hurting the little guy, and he was in a way anticipating today's argument that you have economic injustice of 2 cities, and that the Democrats, then he pivoted to the Democrats, he argued, starting with Franklin Roosevelt and even before with the progressives, forward, having a plan to have in favor of the common good, in favor of everybody having a fair shake. And P.S., he was eloquent, and his son told the told the stage managers of the convention to turn off all the lights on the floor, so all the TV attention was on Governor
Julie,
Mario Cuomo.
Great memories. Thank you very much. David Greenberg, was that a surprise to people at that time that Mario Cuomo was so effective in that context?
Well, it was something of a surprise. I mean, he wasn't, yet the huge national figure that he would become. He was, of course, the governor of New York, and by virtue of that office, was a national player. Some people thought that keynote speech would be given to Ted Kennedy, but Cuomo, who was very much in a sort of similar political tradition, got the nod. And as the caller said, Reagan is out there talking about the shining city on the hill, and Cuomo says, and he says it explicitly, this is a tale of 2 cities, and pointing to those who had been left behind by the Reagan revival. And look, 1984 was a year of galloping economic growth. So the economy, after the doldrums of the Carter years and the Reagan recession of the early Reagan presidency, was now back at full strength. But Cuomo wanted to direct people's attention to, those who were left behind, those who were still struggling financially. And again, this is an issue that hasn't gone away. We can say we have a strong economy now, but there's still a lot of people who are feeling the hurt. And how politicians, can address both those things remains sort of a rhetorical challenge. But there's no question that this, again, like the Kennedy speech of 1980, kept the flame of liberalism alive during a time when, Ronald Reagan and his conservative vision seemed to be dominant in the country.
So dominant that Reagan not only beat Mondale in a landslide nationally, Reagan even won New York, Cuomo's home state, the last time a Republican presidential candidate won this state.
Yeah, no question about it. I mean, that was, really the last true landslide election we'd had. 1988, Reagan's Vice President George Bush defeats Michael Dukakis, the Democrat, pretty handily, but, maybe it's not really a landslide. In 1984, sort of the combination of economic return, patriotism, this was the summer of the Olympics in Los Angeles, and a lot of kind of flag waving, a sense perhaps that we were sort of turning the corner in the Cold War, although that really wouldn't come for a few more years. All those things, I think, would have made it difficult for any Democrat to defeat Reagan in '84.
It's 100 years of 100 things. Thing number 14, 100 years of memorable moments from Democratic convention speeches, mostly by speakers other than the nominee. We'll continue with more of those with historian David Greenberg when we continue in a minute. And one speech from a nominee from decades ago that David wants to highlight. Stay tuned and see who that is. Brian Lehrer on WNYC in our 100 Years of 100 Things series, thing number 14, 100 years of memorable moments from Democratic convention speeches, mostly by speakers other than the nominee, with David Greenberg, journalism, media studies, and history professor at Rutgers and author of the book Republic of Spin, An Inside History of the American Presidency. And this is more of a tape-oriented segment than a call-in oral history segment. Listeners, we've got some more interesting clips to play from the past. But if you have anything really good and really short that might be a memory of a speech moment or something off the stage that was not from the nominee at a Democratic convention. We took one call from Julian Hastings reflecting on that Mario Cuomo 1984 speech. 212-433 WNYC, 212-433-9692. So from 84, we jump ahead 20 years for the next example of a memorable convention speech by a speaker other than the Democratic nominee. The year is 2004. The nominee is John Kerry. The speaker is a little-known state legislator from Illinois, not a national figure at that time, but a candidate for U.S. Senate from Illinois, a young state legislator named Barack Obama, who got the whole country's attention with a speech that included this.
Now, even as we speak, there are those who are preparing to divide us. The spin masters, the negative ad peddlers, who embrace the politics of anything goes. Well, I say to them tonight, there is not a liberal America and a conservative America. There is the United States of America. There is not a black America and a white America and Latino America and Asian America. There's the United States of America. The pundits like to slice and dice our country into red states and blue states, red states for Republicans, blue states for Democrats. But I've got news for them, too. We worship an awesome God in the blue states, and we don't like federal agents poking around in our libraries in the red states. We coach Little League in the blue states, and yes, we've got some gay friends in the red states. There are patriots who opposed the war in Iraq, and there are patriots who supported the war in Iraq. We are one people, all of us pledging allegiance to the Stars and Stripes, all of us defending the United States of America.
Illinois state legislator Barack Obama in 2004. David Greenberg, did the Democratic Party leadership have any idea the Obama speech would resonate the way it did?
Well, probably not quite the way it did. I mean, it really was a sensation. But there was I remember I was writing about politics at the time. There was some chatter beforehand. This guy's really good. There was a sense of anticipation among people in the know that the audience was in store for something special. But most Americans tuning in had no idea who this guy was. He was a candidate for Senate, not yet a senator even. He had, as Obama likes to say about himself, this funny name. Who was this guy? And John Kerry had seen him and met him, and John Kerry actually was the one who really tapped him to give that keynote address. And it's sort of a shame, at least in the version I'm hearing, you don't have the crowd noise in it, because that's such a experiential part of rewatching or re-listening to Obama's speech. He just tapped into something which I think is probably many times more acute now. And in fact, Obama sounded some of these same themes in his speech last night.
That's right. And you say many times more acute, but maybe one thing we learned from that 2004 clip is that while we sometimes talk about a polarized country today as if it's a unique time, the country was polarized in 2004 too, largely over the Iraq War and George W. Bush's response to 9/11 generally. And there was Obama with his speech about One America.
Yeah. And that was sort of the beginnings of this polarization that has widened since. He has to explain to us, because he and his team must have thought, maybe they won't know which are red states and which are blue states. So he has to specify back then which is Democratic, which is Republican. But certainly you saw those divisions emerging then. And Obama, quite admirably was, trying to bridge that, I think, much the way Joe Biden did. And in some ways, we have to acknowledge that was unsuccessful. It was successful enough for Obama to be twice elected and have in many ways a successful presidency. But, particularly the line about in the red states, they don't want federal agents in the libraries. You think about, the book bans and what's going on, particularly in some of the red states. And you sort of wonder, right. I hope that's still true. I hope there's still enough concern among conservatives about that kind of, intrusion into our libraries.
I want to acknowledge one caller, Peter in Franklin Lakes, who's pointing out a speech that we definitely could have pulled the clip from pertaining to George W. Bush. I think this was in 2000 when Bush was running the first time against Al Gore, and he was the Republican governor of Texas. And the former Democratic governor of Texas, Ann Richards, gave a very funny, stinging speech that had the zinger that George W. Bush was born with a silver foot in his mouth. So just acknowledging.
My recollection, Ryan, is that was about George Bush Sr.
Oh, maybe it was. Oh, really? Oh, maybe it was.
And people forget because the son was perhaps more inarticulate than the father. But George Bush Sr. also was known for his gaffes and stumbles. And I think that was in 88.
How about that? You're right, 1988. Yep, my producer just looked it up and confirmed things get compressed. All right, to complete the set, here's one more speech clip from someone other than the nominee, and it's from last night. And it's from Senator Bernie Sanders, who, of course, tried for the nomination and didn't make it in 2016 and 2020. It did influence the party and the country. Last night, he was sounding his perennial themes while not criticizing Kamala Harris in any way for not embracing every policy point in exactly his way.
These oligarchs tell us we shouldn't tax the rich. The oligarchs tell us we shouldn't take on price gouging. We shouldn't expand Medicare to cover dental, hearing, and vision. And we shouldn't increase Social Security benefits for struggling seniors. Well, I've got some bad news for them. That is precisely what we are going to do.
Bernie last night. Thoughts briefly, because I want to get to the 1966 Bill Clinton clip you brought to our attention. Thoughts briefly on Bernie Sanders, who last I looked, maybe he did in the last few days, had not officially endorsed Kamala Harris, but got that primetime speaking slot anyway last night.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, I'm sure he will get on board. You know, Sanders likes to stick to his guns and his message. He's not really anyone's idea of a classic team player, but he does, at the end of the day, get with the program. He did it with Biden after being sort of the one holdout, remember, in the primaries in 2020. Look, he uses this kind of tinny language, oligarchs and stuff that I think, you know, has a limited appeal. But the idea of government continuing to be a source of a strong social safety net, that I think does resonate with mainstream liberals and with, you know, Americans outside the Democratic Party too.
Right. We
So
could
in that sense, an
debate
important
how
point.
limited, and he did say he would do everything he could to get Kamala Harris elected. So he's certainly in that way endorsing her, and did in that speech. One more clip to play outside the theme of this segment, which is non-nominees from past conventions. You drew our attention to this as one that you think has relevance to the Harris campaign. It's Bill Clinton when he was running successfully for re-election in 1996. This is from what came to be known as his Bridge to the 21st Century convention speech.
Tonight, my fellow Americans, I ask all of our fellow citizens to join me and to join you in building that bridge to the 21st century. 4 years now from now, just 4 years from now, think of it, we begin a new century full of enormous possibilities. We have to give the American people the tools they need to make the most of their God-given potential. We must make the basic bargain of opportunity and responsibility available to all Americans, not just a few. That is the promise of the Democratic Party. That is the promise of America. I want to build a bridge to the 21st century in which we expand opportunity through education, where computers are as much a part of the classroom as blackboards, where highly trained teachers demand peak performance from our students, where every 8-year-old can point to a book and say, I can read it myself.
Bill Clinton, 96. Now we're trying to get computers out of the classrooms. We've got about 30 seconds, David. Why was that speech on your mind?
Well, for one thing, 96 was the first convention I attended, and I remember it vividly. But more important, you know, Clinton did something that is somewhat analogous to what Harris has to do as someone who's continuing the Biden agenda, as it were, which is he articulates a vision of the future. The first part of the speech is defending his record, what we've done so far. But it's that vision of the future that excites people. It's not at all backward looking. It's laying out there's more to be done and talking about education, technology, investment, all those things that make people, you know, have hope, to put meat on the bones of this idea of hope.
And that has to be the last word from David Greenberg from Rutgers, author of Republic of Spin, an inside history of the American presidency. Look for his new one coming out soon. That's a biography of John Lewis. And that's our 100 Years of 100 Things segment for today. Thank you. This was great, David. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Good to be with you.